Hello, this is James Studinger with the Wealth is a Choice Project. NATO defense spending, a nonpartisan historical analysis of who spent what drove the changes, and what it all means, from Kennedy to Trump. The U.S. spent 3.4% of 2024 GDP on military. Europe and Canada in 2024, for the first time, they hit their 2% target. Then we have a new target, a 5% target that was recently agreed to at the latest summit, and looking to have that fully implemented by 2035. So in the last 76 years of this conversation on NATO spending, we're going to review it going back all the way from President Kennedy to President Donald Trump. First of all, what does NATO funding actually mean? When politicians debate NATO spending, they're almost always talking about two entirely different things, and confusing them is one of the most common misunderstandings in the public debate. So first of all, track one, the NATO Common Fund. NATO operates as an organization. It has headquarters in Brussels, a military command structure, staff, shared infrastructure, and joint programs. All 32 members contribute to a pooled fund to run the organization itself. This is called the Common Fund. So what does that pay for? The civil budget, headquarters and staff, the military budget, the integrated command structures, early warning systems, joint missions, and the NATO Security Investment Program, all shared physical infrastructure, including air bases, fuel pipelines, harbor facilities, and communications networks across member countries. This is approximately $5 billion in the 2025 total budget for all 32 members. The United States share is 15.9% as of 2025, matching Germany's share. The total annual contribution for the U.S. is around $753 million, less than 0.1% of the U.S. defense budget. For historical context, the U.S. share of the Common Fund increased from 22.5% in 1952 to a peak of 28.45% in 1987. In 2005, NATO adopted a formula that set a ceiling on the U.S. shares, freezing it at its then existing level of around 22%. Trump negotiated it down to 16% starting in 2021, matching Germany's contribution. The Common Fund is roughly 0.3% of total NATO military spending. It is not what the burden-sharing debate is primarily about. The second track, NATO defense spending. That's the 2% or now 5% debate. Separate from the Common Fund, NATO members have agreed that each country should invest at least 2% of its own GDP in its own military, its own troops, equipment, training, bases, and readiness. This money does not go to NATO. It stays in each country's defense budget. The theory, a strong alliance, is only as strong as its members' individual militaries. So the NATO members, including the U.S., have around a $5 billion NATO Common Fund for all 32 members, $1.5 trillion combined national defense spending for the 2025 estimated total. The Common Fund is roughly 0.3% of total NATO military spending. The 2 to 5% national spending debate is about the other 99.7%. And it's what every U.S. president from Kennedy to Trump has been pressuring allies about. Are the 2% and 5% pledges legally binding? This is one of the most important and least understood aspects of the entire debate. The short answer, they're not legally binding, but that does not mean they carry no weight. Here's what the actual treaty says. The 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, the binding legal document that created NATO, does not mention a specific percentage of GDP. Article 3 states that members shall maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack, but leaves the amount entirely to national discretion. No amendment has ever changed this. But the pledges have evolved. In 2006, the Riga Summit, NATO defense ministers endorsed the 2% guideline for the first time, described as a guideline, not a pledge, no deadline, no enforcement mechanism. In 2014, the Wales Summit. After Russia seized Crimea, all 28 NATO heads of state signed a declaration pledging to move toward 2% within a decade. Language was deliberately soft. Members aimed to meet this target, not shall. Only 3 of 28 met it at the time. In 2023, the Vilnius Summit, the 2% target was upgraded from aim toward to an enduring commitment. The softer aspiration became a stated floor. Still not legally binding, but the language hardened significantly. The 2025 Hague Summit. This is where all 32 members, except Spain, which negotiated a partial exemption, agreed to a new 5% target, 3.5% on core defense, and 1.5% on security-related spending, including infrastructure, cyber defense, and civil resilience. Members must now file annual plans to show a credible path to reach it. If it's not legally binding, then why does it matter? Here are 4 reasons the pledge has real teeth even without legal force. There's diplomatic credibility. Countries that miss the target are publicly identified in NATO's annual report. This affects their standing and bargaining power within the alliance on every other issue. U.S. political leverage. The 2% metric is used in the United States Congress to divide allies into partners and free riders when debating America's own commitments and troop deployment in Europe. There's the self-set standard. Every member signed the declaration voluntarily. Missing a commitment you made to your own allies, even a political one, carries real reputational cost in multilateral diplomacy. Then there's annual accounting plans, the new in 2025. The Hague Commitment added a mechanism no previous pledge had. Members must file annual plans showing a credible, incremental path to 5%, creating a paper trail that makes non-compliance more visible than ever before. So the bottom line is Trump's framing that allies owe money is technically inaccurate. No dues are paid to the U.S., and no back payments are required. But his underlying point that allies pledged to spend 2%, and most spent years ignoring that pledge, is factually correct and supported by almost every U.S. president illustration on record. These solemn political commitments between allied nations, not legally binding treaties, but agreements with real consequences for allies' credibility and capability. From a partnership standpoint, an argument could be made that one party that does not keep with its obligations owes the other party for pulling more weight. For example, Company A and Company B agree to partner, and each spend 2% of gross revenue on R&D. 20 years later, Company A spent 3%, while Company B only spent 1%. And yet Company B benefited from the additional burden Company A spent on R&D. Then Company A could take a position that Company B didn't pull their weight and owes Company A. So let's take a look at the historical record. What drove spending up and down? The data tells a clear story over 76 years. Every major increase in European defense spending correlates with either a Russian military action or sustained U.S. political pressure. Every major decrease correlates with reduced Russian threat perception or a period when the U.S. was not pressing. This pattern holds without exception from 1949 through 2025, and it is entirely nonpartisan because both phenomena occurred under presidents of both parties. We've got the Cold War era, 1949 to 1989. High spending, real threat. 1949, NATO was founded. European spending rose from post-World War II lows as nations built standing forces. The U.S. contributed more than 70% of NATO's total spending throughout the 1950s and 1960s. In 1950, we had the Korean War, the sharpest spending spike in NATO history. The U.S. surged above 13% of GDP. All European allies sharply increased budgets. In 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, prompted NATO's shift from massive retaliation to flexible response doctrine in 1967, requiring larger, sustained conventional forces. In 1969, Detente begins. Nixon-Kissinger diplomacy, SALT I in 1972 and Helsinki Accords in 1975 reduced perceived urgency. Vietnam fatigue and stagflation compounded European budget cuts. In 1977, NATO 3% pledge with Carter, the first formal burden-sharing commitment. Members agreed to increase spending 3% annually in real terms, driven by alarm over Soviet SS-20 missile deployments targeting European cities. In 1979, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan ended the détente. Reagan was elected in 1980 on a platform of rearmament. Sharp spending increases on both sides of the Atlantic followed. Then we had the peace-divided era, 1989 through 2001, where they created a decline in spending that nobody fixed until more recently. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, the most dramatic spending decline in NATO history. European spending fell from approximately $300 billion to $250 billion over the following decade. The Soviet threat that had justified decades of investment was gone. In 1991, USSR dissolved. This accelerated peace dividend cuts. European NATO members reduced spending to historic lows through the 1990s, prioritizing social programs and European integration. No president, including Clinton, applied meaningful pressure to reverse this during the 1990s. That brings us to the modern era, 2001 through 2025, where there was pressure, promises, and progress toward increased NATO spending. In 2001, we have 9/11, of course, and Article 5. Article 5 was invoked for the only time in NATO history. But the nature of the threat, terrorism, not Soviet invasion, mainly drove U.S. spending up dramatically. European spending barely moved despite alliance commitments in Afghanistan. In 2006, the 2% guideline was formalized. There was little immediate effect, and the guideline was on paper only. Bush pushed for it at the Riga summit. European spending continued its decline. In 2014, Russia annexes Crimea. This is the first real inflection point. Russia's seizure of Crimea was the first forcible annexation of European territory since World War II. At the Wales Summit in September 2014, all 28 heads of state signed the Defense Investment Pledge, committing to 2% within a decade. Only 3 of 28 met it at the time. European spending finally stopped declining. In 2017, Trump publicly confronted NATO allies in a way no predecessor had. He signaled out Germany directly and threatened to reconsider U.S. commitments. His approach was different in degree and tone. Real annual growth in European spending jumped to approximately 5%, the biggest non-crisis 2-year spike since the Cold War. $130 billion in new spending was added through 2017 to 2019. In 2021, Biden took a more traditional diplomatic approach to ease the urgency. The chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan also raised questions about U.S. reliability. European spending growth temporarily slowed. In 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, the most consequential trigger in a generation. Germany announced a €100 billion special defense fund within days. An 11% real increase in European and Canadian spending followed in 2023, the highest annual increase in NATO history. By 2024, Europe collectively crossed 2% of GDP for military spending for the first time ever. In 2025, the Hague Summit, all 32 allies met 2% for the first time. A new 5% target was agreed to by 2035. The average across all NATO members hit 2.76%, the highest since the Cold War. All right, let's take a look at the presidential record to see who said what. Most presidents, since Dwight Eisenhower, have urged European allies to spend more on defense. This is not a partisan issue. It's a persistent structural tension that crosses party lines, administrations, and decades. What changed over time was tone and results. So digging into some presidential remarks, President Kennedy, speaking to the National Security Council on January 22, 1963, he said, "We cannot continue to pay for the military protection of Europe while the NATO states are not paying their fair share and living off the fat of the land. He also asked, why should we have in Europe supplies adequate to fight for 90 days when the European forces around our troops have only enough supplies to fight for 2 or 3 days? With President Nixon, the term burden sharing was formally institutionalized as U.S. policy. His Treasury Secretary wrote to Nixon in 1970, a satisfactory burden-sharing arrangement with our NATO allies would help us in the alliance politically, militarily, and financially. The Nixon administration negotiated bilateral offset agreements with Germany and pursued multilateral burden-sharing frameworks. With President Reagan, in September 12, 1984, letter to Congress on NATO conventional defense, Reagan wrote, "The United States cannot fill the gap alone. Every member of the alliance must participate in improving conventional forces. We will continue to prod all allies to make better contributions to NATO defense." President Clinton focused almost entirely on NATO expansion. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic joining in 1999, rather than burden-sharing pressure. The 1990s were the decade European defense spending fell most dramatically. Clinton's absence from the pressure record is still itself historically significant. The lack of urgency allowed peace dividend cuts to continue unchecked. Then George Bush Jr. at the 2006 Regis Summit said every NATO nation must make the defense investments necessary to give NATO the capabilities it needs. At the 2008 Bucharest Summit, he said building a strong NATO alliance also requires a strong European defense capacity. So at this summit, I will encourage our European partners to increase their defense investments to support both NATO and European operations. America believes if Europeans invest in their own defense, they will also be stronger and more capable when we deploy together. In Brussels in March of 2014, President Obama said, if we have got collective defense, it means that everybody has to chip in. I've had some concerns about a diminished level of defense spending among some of our partners in NATO. The trend lines have been going down. At the 2016 Warsaw Summit, Obama continued, for those of you doing the math, that means that the majority of allies are still not hitting that 2% mark, an obligation we agreed to in Wales. So we had a very candid conversation about this. Everybody has got to step up. At the 2018 NATO breakfast in Brussels, President Trump said, many countries are not paying what they should. Frankly, many countries owe us a tremendous amount of money for many years back, where they are delinquent as far as I'm concerned. At the 2025 Hague Summit, NATO Secretary General Rutte credited Trump directly. America expects European allies and Canada to contribute more, and that is exactly what we see them doing. So there's a bipartisan pattern. Bush asked politely, Obama asked firmly but diplomatically, and Trump demanded loudly. All three got some results. The data shows that the combination of Russian military aggression and sustained U.S. pressure from any president of any party is what actually moves European defense budgets. Neither factor alone has been sufficient. So let's talk about the dollar gap and why the numbers matter. If you look at the chart where you see the percentages of what a country contributes, it tells one story. If you look at the dollar chart, it tells another story. And both together make the most important point. The U.S. defense spending in 2024 was nearly $1 trillion at $967 billion. In 2024, Europe and Canada combined spent about $482 billion on military. That's a gap of $485 billion in 2024. And the GDP of the United States is very comparable in size to the combined GDP of Europe and Canada. So the GDP comparisons matter. The U.S. and its European NATO allies have roughly comparable economies. The European Union, United Kingdom, and Canada together have a combined GDP of approximately $26 trillion, compared to the U.S. GDP of approximately $29 trillion. With similar size economies, a persistent 1.4% GDP spending gap translates directly into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Over the decade from 2006 to 2016, European allies and Canada collectively fell short of their own 2% pledge every single year. The annual shortfall averaged roughly $80 to $100 billion per year. Over nearly 2 decades, this represents well over $1 trillion in defense spending that was pledged but not delivered, investment that the United States effectively subsidized by maintaining its alliance commitments regardless of what other allies spent. A note worth mentioning, the dollar comparison comparing raw dollar amounts between the U.S. and European allies can be a little misleading. The U.S. spends 3.4% of its own GDP by choice, well above the 2% target, because the United States maintains a global military posture extending far beyond Europe. The U.S. will always dominate the dollar figures, even if every ally meets its 2% obligation. The more relevant question is whether European allies are meeting their own agreed commitment. And for most of the past 30 years, the answer was no. We can draw a few conclusions the data supports clearly and without partisan framing. The burden-sharing complaint is not a Trump invention. It predates him by more than 60 years and has been voiced by most presidents since Eisenhower in official documents, speeches, and classified memos. Russia is the primary driver of European defense investment. Every major increase in European spending corresponds to a Russian military action. Korea, Soviet threat, Afghanistan invasion, Crimea annexation, and the full Ukraine invasion. The pattern is consistent and nonpartisan. U.S. presidential pressure has a measurable secondary effect. The Carter 3% pledge, Reagan's sustained pressure, and Trump's confrontational approach at Brussels all produced documented spending increases. Quieter administrations produced quieter results. Europe is genuinely catching up. In 2014, 3 allies met the 2% mark. By 2024, 23 did. By 2025, all 32 did. This is real progress driven by real events, not rhetoric alone. The 2% and new 5% pledges are political, not legal. They are solemn commitments between allied governments, enforceable only through diplomatic pressure and reputational consequence. The dollar gap is large and real. While comparable GDPs, spending at 1.4% versus 3.4% creates a gap of hundreds of billions annually. Over decades, that gap has compounded into a genuine imbalance in the alliance's defense infrastructure.